Everyone, it's Alex, and today I wanted to talk about what is probably like a really big literary phenomenon that has been growing in the past few years, and that's with the popularity of the book The Secret History by Donna Tartt. In general, I think like book trends are just fascinating, like between, of course, places like BookTube or Bookstagram or also Book Talk. But I think there's probably no greater chokehold than The Secret History with people, especially I feel like it's a generalization to say, but with younger readers that might skew between teens to early 20s, in which I feel like they really latch onto a lot of elements from The Secret History involving like teenagers or young adults, and also spaces like schools, and how all of those things are kind of present within certain types of fiction that I think that readers of The Secret History would also enjoy elsewhere. And if there's one common thread, I think it's that people really like that The Secret History is very autumnal, and it makes people think of this time of year as fall is approaching. And with that in mind, it also makes me think, of course, with a very wonderful BookTube event happening next month in October called Victober. As the name might suggest, or if you've never heard of it before, Victober is a BookTube event where you read Victorian literature within the month of October, because they share a lot of similar vibes with being quite dark and brooding and mysterious or gothic. So if you love The Secret History by Donna Tartt, I think you might really like these Victorian books, but of course that goes on to say or introduce what exactly are characteristics, or what is maybe the context, at least briefly, behind Victorian literature. I would say the first important thing to note is that Victorian literature isn't a genre, rather it's just based on a time period of the mid-ish 1800s to the early 1900s. And because of the Victorian era having great content, I would say, for inspiring stories, it really developed genres more fully between people seeking fiction for what reflected their real life, especially involving things like social class, or at least class disparity. And through fiction, it kind of helped bridge the gap between being this greater sense in the Victorian era of this morality, and how people felt more accountable for sort of their role in life, thinking of the bigger picture, which fiction definitely helped sort of realize. Which might be on the basis of the Victorian books I'm talking about, or some, like in general, like characteristic of Victorian literature is that Gothic element I mentioned, where the world at times feels very uncertain or mysterious, or has this general presence of the unknown, or at least within these stories that there's this sense of like other. Although to create that more tangibly, I would say it's through fiction having these very brooding and dark landscapes, especially, that often these characters would inhabit and try to make sense of. And thinking of storytelling and, keeping it engaged and interesting, often these Victorian stories having these supernatural elements, or believing in superstition, to where they try to make sense of things going on in their life through, again, this mystery or intrigue, which might be no surprise that involving things like mystery, the Victorian era was the birth of the Sherlock Holmes novels, which became very popular during that time. Again, kind of creating that balance between readers of the Victorian era thinking about the accountability of the disparity in things like social class, where it made even the novels they were reading feel they were fictitious, but it kind of made it mirror to where real life at times, just with that large class imbalance, how others' lives felt like fiction in their own way. Then having a lot of Victorian stories like being about this ending that had like a life lesson, or really diving deep into morality of trying to distinguish what is good and what is bad, and how the reader can decide that. And through all of these characteristics of the Victorian era with literature, I really do think that readers of The Secret History would like Victorian literature. For some context on The Secret History, in case you haven't read it before, it is about this group of classmates that are all taking this one classics class in college, and they're all very intellectual, or like to think they are, so they crave a lot of conversation about things like life and beauty, and they're perfectly snotty. And this feels like the perfect backdrop or perfect ingredients for creating this general concern or thematic concern towards that moral rearing that I was talking about earlier, that's often a part of Victorian literature. Although, especially with this idea of imbalances, where our main character, Richard Papin, in The Secret History is definitely characterized as the outcast, since he's a newer student. I think he's a transfer student that goes to this college, and he's really interested in this mysterious classics class. Even literally with Richard thinking of his classmates clearly have more of a privilege, like through their access to resources than Richard does, emphasizing again that imbalance. Although despite this, I would say with all of the characters, they have their own kind of awakening towards that accountability of the information they know kind of shaping their identity that might haunt them forever. And what is part of this haunting quality is that The Secret History in itself is actually in a way its own mystery, since we're introduced to the novel in the beginning by finding out that someone is dead and somehow all of these characters and these classmates are involved. Mixing that premise with how Tart very masterfully crafts this atmosphere of a New England college town and just college campus, it really feels like a modern playground of just taking, to me, these Victorian elements and just transitioning it or upgrading it into the modern novel, or at least in this time period of when The Secret History was published in the 1990s. Especially, I would describe like Victorian literature often being very dramatized for, again, the sake of those very Gothic elements of surprise or emphasizing the unfamiliarity or unknown, the real world. I think of The Secret History in a scene where Richard, I think during winter break, nearly dies, and how that felt like just a sweeping dramatic time, even if it was something about so mundane and ordinary as a college student's winter break. Which nicely reminds me that ultimately with The Secret History, I'm just reading about a bunch of stupid teenagers. So again, with my hypothesis that with this new generation of readers, it seems, with The Secret History really liking it, as The Secret History for me too, when I started reading in general a few years ago, is really what got me into reading. So hopefully these Victorian books can be nice sort of adjacent Secret History vibes that they can like. So up first, I want to mention Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Villette may often live in the shadow of Charlotte Bronte's other novel, Jane Eyre, which I really love, to the point where I was waking up from wisdom teeth removal and I would not apparently stop talking about Jane Eyre. But Villette to me, I think, has that perfect blend of independence and kookiness, especially when I think of The Secret History. And I think Villette feels much more relatable in that sense. We're introduced to our young heroine, Lucy Snow, in Villette, as she's traveling to Villette to start her new life as a caregiver, along with learning French. And we actually don't get to know a lot of context behind Lucy's life, since she is very conscious about withholding information about herself. Maybe much like a young person, only wanting to identify all the good parts about themselves. This unexplained tragedy, especially with her family, is a bit mysterious, but kind of leans into these later Gothic elements toward the end of the book, where there's this freakish storm and Lucy's like hallucinating stuff and it gets really weird. But I think the true magic of it all, besides those Gothic elements, is that Lucy, when it comes down to it, I think she is just this very clumsy yet self-reflective person. And I think that's really the appeal of this book, and how I think in comparison to like Villette to Jane Eyre, I think Villette is much more of the modern ingredients of those coming-of-age novels that people really enjoy. But yeah, and plus I think Villette is underrated, so I want more people to read it anyway. Up next, I want to mention Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. Thinking back to my description of Victorian era literature being about this class disparity or social disparity, I think Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a great example of that, as we follow a main character named Tess, and I think she's this great sort of beacon of this existential helplessness. As Tess's introduction to us as readers is very, perhaps, hashtag relatable, as she's trying to buy this new horse for her family, so we've all been there. Although Tess burdens herself with this goal as she's trying to help her family rise from the bottom of the barrel of their social class, and it's pretty much all a downward spiral from there for Tess, as Tess meets these other characters who basically at every turn repeatedly take advantage of her. And I think this is Hardy really talking about things like mercy and morality, again with the Victorian era really trying to hone in on this sense of, to me, accountability of a reader's acknowledgement of real life within the fiction they're reading, since the fiction really identified with trying to mimic the sort of spaces in which people inhabit at that time, as like cities themselves feel like their own character. As where Tess is repeatedly being taken advantage of, it's kind of like this purgatory where it's less about Tess like realizing that and more about these other people that are interacting with her and repeatedly being offensive toward her based on how they treat her. As characters in The Secret History, I think also really value the accountability of interpersonal relationships. I think Tess of the D'Urbervilles, in a way, is somewhat of a blueprint to that on the basis of Hardy really trying to make readers so self-conscious about how others are treated. And again, that sense of accountability. So yeah, and plus with Tess, again, being a young protagonist, I think a lot of readers of The Secret History would maybe really enjoy this, or really just Thomas Hardy in general. My second to last recommendation is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I think out of all of the recommendations I'm giving today, that Dorian Gray is maybe the most deliberately philosophical, as we follow a man named Dorian who's really obsessed with surface level beauty, and then we get other characters who are also preoccupied by beauty but trying to interpret it through projections of an aesthetic outcome. Or to put it more simply, Dorian is just someone that thinks he's hot all the time. As the theme of beauty bleeds into thoughts on mortality and vanity, as The Secret History too is, I would say its main theme is probably the conceptions of beauty and what that means, as they all each try to identify that. I think specifically with, I don't remember his name, I think the character's name is Henry, and how in The Secret History he says, beauty is terror. And I feel like the whole book is based on that theme of characters trying to figure out what that means. But I think Dorian Gray is a great story about the consequences of thought, or your intellectual ruminations only get you so far, on the basis of this wonderful blend of how Oscar Wilde blends this Gothic sense of atmosphere within the consequences of what goes on through Dorian's mind as he's going through this novel and thinking again about those other common Victorian themes like morality and maybe in a way also things like crime and justice, and how the sense of a consequence of corruption is this basis of having to identify and look inwardly whether or not we really know who we are, or maybe we just want to live in the comfort of how other people perceive us. I would also say, between everything I've mentioned for this video, that Dorian Gray is probably the most accessible in terms of Victorian literature, so if you're curious about starting, I'd probably start here. And my final recommendation for this video is a little indie darling, and that is Withering Heights by Emily Bronte. I know this is a very popular staple of the Victorian era for literature, but I feel like Withering Heights is really a book that only gets better as you age. When you basically realize you're reading this horrible story about horrible people that have no redeeming qualities at all. But I think what really sells it for me is the unreliability of this character, Nellie Dean, who is recounting this experience between all these characters that take up the space of the novel. As Nellie Dean particularly talks about two wonderful characters, Heathcliff and Catherine, who are probably one of the most interesting characters I've read in fiction, but also the most dramatic characters I've ever read in fiction. And where Emily Bronte uses love as this vehicle of morality, or looking inwardly at oneself, I think between Heathcliff and Catherine's relationship, it really shows kind of the, in my perspective, the satirical aspect of one's quest for what they believe in. And just because you believe in something strongly doesn't always mean it's good or healthy. As Withering Heights is basically a story about one long, giant breakup, I think Emily Bronte smartly weaves in wonderful storytelling, but also with these brooding and mysterious elements of atmosphere that really show just how ingrained it can be, that even if you talk about really positive experiences, maybe like romance or love, that they are not spared from being under ridicule, under really insistent observation. And I know I use the word breakup, but I can't stress enough at what point it's way beyond just that. Like when you start daydreaming about being buried to your lover's grave, even while you're alive, you look forward to bestowing havoc among the next generation of your bloodline. So yeah, you can't tell me that none of the characters in The Secret History would not eat up Withering Heights. It is the blueprint, and it's probably why they all go to school in the first place, I'm sure. So yeah, that does it for this video. For anyone that really loves The Secret History and you're trying to look for those Secret History-esque books, Maybe not as literally about like what the contents are about, but just kind of the vibe of maybe what I feel like Victorian literature is a great sort of nosedive into reading more books within those same themes. And again, also thinking of Victober or Victorian October on BookTube, I'm going to leave links down below for our wonderful hosts that are yet again hosting this event for us, for all of us to enjoy. That way you can familiarize yourself even with some prompts in case Victorian literature can kind of, maybe like all of it can make more sense for you based on the introduction videos that the hosts are giving. So I'll be sure to link those down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.